6 p.m. and we are ready to go when you are.
Great, thank you very much. Well, welcome, good evening. Welcome to the regular Bellevue City Council meeting for March 7th, 2022. Clerk, could you please do the roll call?
Yes, Mayor Robinson.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Neuenhouse.
Here.
Councilmember Barksdale.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Councilmember Robertson.
Here.
Councilmember Stokes.
Here.
And Councilmember Zahn.
Here.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lee, could you please lead us in the flag salute?
Yes, Madam Mayor. I pledge allegiance to the flag
To the flag.
America,
States of America.
and to the
flag for which it stands, one nation,
nation
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible, with
with
liberty
liberty and
justice
justice for
for all.
Thank
Thank
you. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, clerk, do we have anybody signed up for oral communications tonight?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. There are 2 pre-registered speakers for oral communications. And with that, I will call our first speaker, who is Christian Dorset. Mr. Dorset, I do not see you connected by name. If you are in fact connected, can you please use the raise hand function and let me know you are here? And I do not see Mr. Dorset's hand. The second speaker on the list is Luca Macadar. Mr. Macadar, can you hear me? Mr. Macadar, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes,
There
hello.
you go. It's a pleasure to see you all here.
Can I ask staff to reset the countdown to 3 minutes, please?
I won't even take that long.
Hang on one second. I'm going to give you, staff, if you can start the countdown, I'm going to give you an extra 15 seconds, 16 seconds on the back end. You can start your comments now.
All right. So I'll keep it short. There is a certain Chick-fil-A on 8th Street in 116th. I'm sure you might have heard about it before, but it has a queue line it's a fast food establishment, and it has a queue line that backs up onto the exit of the 405. Now, usually there's oncoming traffic from 116th, and often on my commute to work, I find myself not being able to turn when it's a really busy day, as cars back up onto the middle of the intersection, and or just also on the left side of the road. It makes it very difficult for me to turn into my lane and go to work. It's been a pretty reoccurring issue with some exceptions of it not occurring, but I just thought it would be good to bring that to your attention today. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Macadar. At this point, that is our last pre-registered speaker. If there is anyone connected to this call who would like to make communication to the council, please use the raise hand function. And Mayor, I do not see any additional, I do see an additional hand. Hang on one second. Mr. Golaboroko, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Your time begins now.
Dear Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members, thank you so much for standing together with Ukrainian community for resolution that was adopted last week. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend meeting last week, but I truly appreciate and our community that lives in Bellevue, and not just Ukrainians, but I am sure that all the residents of our beautiful city of Bellevue appreciate your leadership and you standing together with people of Ukraine. I had meetings and conversations with some of you, and some of you sent me emails and text messages, and that's friendship, and that's support. That support is what we need in hard times like this. We enjoyed having our largest cultural event on the West Coast in the city of Bellevue, and we would like to keep doing it. We hope that in September, when we're gonna have it, it's gonna be celebration of our victory over evil regime of Putin. And thank you for hosting us and for letting us be part of this beautiful city.
Thank you, Mr. Goloboroko. At this point, that would close oral communications.
Thank you. City Clerk, could you make sure that if that last speaker wants a copy of our resolution from last week, that he gets it, please?
I will send him the speaking points. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve the consent calendar?
I move to approve the consent calendar.
Mayor, there
Oh.
actually is not a consent calendar this evening.
Ah, it's like the first time ever.
Yes.
We'll consent to that.
Motion removed. Okay, so we're on to our study session item. Mr. Miyake, would you like to introduce, please?
Yes, thank you, Mayor and council members. Tonight, we are holding a council budget workshop this evening with respect to the 2023 to 2024 operating budget and 23 to 29 capital improvement program. As you know, this is a budget year for the city in development of those budgets. And as we have done in the past, we are coming to the council early in the process for information and feedback to me as the city manager as I prepare the preliminary budget. There's quite a bit of content we're going to cover tonight with respect to the budget process and timelines. Something new we're going to look at this year is taking a look at our operating budget through an equity lens, as well as our capital budget. We're going to talk about inflation, and then we're going to reground the council with respect to the long-term forecast, as well as some of the challenges we have as we go into the future with respect to expenditures exceeding our revenue lines. And then lastly, we're going to provide an overview and seek feedback on the long-term parks capital planning with respect to funding options on needs that we have there. That is in response to a council priority that was adopted and established back in your last workshop, last retreat. So with that, there is a lot of content, again, that we're going to cover, and we're happy to provide briefings, individual briefings to one or two council members, how many there are up to, without creating a full quorum after this presentation. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tony Call, our finance director, to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, City Manager Miyake. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members, as always, it is a pleasure to be back with you this evening. Thank you once again for having us. City Manager Miyake went through the agenda quite well. I will just make a couple more comments on the agenda in that Evan Phillips, the citywide budget manager, will take the budget process and the update on inflation. I'll come back in and do some work on the general fund forecast and longer term strategies. Evan will return on the capital investment update, and then Michael Shiosaki, Director of Parks and Community Services, is here with us this evening to pick up the long-range Parks capital planning item. You will see this slide a couple more times through the presentation, and we'll be checkboxing off the items that we are through to give you a sense of where we are in the agenda. Otherwise, I think it would be a very long run-on piece. So we'll bring this back a couple of times to give you a check-in on where we are on the agenda as we proceed. With that, I will turn it over to Evan Phillips, the citywide budget manager, to take us through budget process and timeline.
Thank you, Tony. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members. Tonight, I'll be walking you through the proposed 2023-2024 budget process, relevant milestones, and opportunities for public engagement. We are seeking any feedback that you may have on those items, as well as providing initial feedback on the proposal to test and develop an equity lens for this budget cycle. So while this may be old hat for many of you, I wanted to highlight that this process is what we have done for every biennium going back to 2010, and it's called our Budget 1 process. And this process is the best way to identify the priorities of our community through surveys, public hearings, and council input to best prioritize the city's available resources on the city services that the public best desires. So that is a brief overview of our Budget 1 process. But at a very high level, this is the process that the city budget takes throughout any budget development year. So as a first step, all departments submit proposals to the budget office and city leadership that outline the services they provide, the relationship to council's vision and priorities, as well as relevant performance metrics. We are expecting these proposals from departments within the next month. And additionally, our biennium budget survey is out in the field with the community, which we hope will provide timely feedback from residents as this process moves through city staff and on to council. It is important to note that this year's survey now includes statistically valid demographic information, which is a change from past practice. From there, proposals are aggregated and analyzed to provide a comprehensive picture of the entire budget for the city's leadership team, which then provides a citywide budget recommendation onto the city manager for his consideration. During the summer, the city manager prepares his version of the budget called the preliminary budget, which then gets transmitted to council in early fall for council's consideration, modification, and adoption. This timeline shows you the major milestones that will happen throughout the year. Tonight, we are having our budget workshop, and soon council will have a retreat. We will have 2 public hearings, one in late spring and another in early summer, to ensure that as much public input as possible can be brought forward to the city manager's consideration in development of his preliminary budget, which, as I mentioned, council will receive that preliminary budget in September this year, so early fall. City council will debate, we'll have presentations, we'll do general overviews through September, October, with hopefully a tentative adoption date of November 21st. After that preliminary budget is presented, and before that adoption date, we will hold one final public hearing in advance of that adoption date to make sure that the public has one more opportunity to reflect and provide its input on that preliminary budget. So in total, we will have 3 budget hearings throughout the process. Again, one in late spring, one in the summer, and one before adoption later this fall. Public engagement will be consistent with the open process that Bellevue has had for several cycles. There is a website available that outlines these opportunities for public engagement in greater detail. However, broadly, we incorporate feedback from the public through our budget, performance, and business surveys, which are done to determine how Bellevue residents and businesses view the value, importance, and quality of the service that the city provides. We also have 3 public hearings, as I mentioned on the previous slide, as well as opportunities at council meetings for public comment, or as always, submitting written comments to council or the finance and asset management department. And finally, the public can provide feedback to the Human Services, Environmental Services, or Transportation Commissions, as well as the Parks and Community Services Board, all of which will be holding meetings on budget relating topics throughout the year. So there are an ample number of opportunities for public engagement throughout the entire year. Over the next few slides, I'll be walking you through the frameworks that help orient our budget conversation throughout the process. The first of which is the city's budget guiding principles. The city strives to provide quality programs, even if that narrows the scope of services provided, rather than diminish the quality across all Bellevue services. The principles call for a process that looks at the budget as a whole rather than each component part of the budget individually, to better evaluate how the entire city budget measures up against available opportunities, resources, best practices, community input, and long-term financial sustainability. For more detail on any of these guiding principles, there is additional information in tonight's agenda packet. This budget will continue to be framed using the 7 strategic target areas as outlined in Council's 21 through 2023 Vision and Priorities document. All city departments, services, and lines of businesses are included in one of these target areas. And it is important to note that these strategic target areas are the same as what was included in the 2021-2022 adopted budget. So that should allow easy comparison between bienniums to see how those priorities have shifted over time. As part of tonight's presentation, staff does seek some feedback on the development and testing of an equity lens for the budget process. An equity lens like performance metrics, community surveys, council priorities, and financial forecasts would serve as another tool in our toolbox to inform the city's budget decision-making. Each one of these tools has evolved with our Budget One process, and as that Budget One process matures, we hope to incorporate more diverse inputs to ensure that the city's decision-making around all things budget is rigorous and considers as many variables as practical. This initial proposal would take the very first steps in this effort by looking at operational data available to determine how the city currently is allocating its resources across select services within Bellevue neighborhoods. Specifically, this information would be mapped and would include appropriate narrative storytelling and be set alongside demographic information such as race and ethnicity and median household income, among many others. This limited approach would serve as a baseline of our current state and would cover many but not all services provided by the city, as not every service has geographic data and can be mapped alongside spending and demographics. At the end of the day, the goal of this first attempt is to develop a tool that works for our process and creates a solid baseline that we could build from in subsequent budget cycles. This deliberate approach is informed by other Puget Sound jurisdictions, including the city of Tacoma, as well as the Port of Seattle. So before we move on to our next item, I do want to provide an opportunity for questions, comments, and feedback on the overall budget process and the equity lens in particular.
Great, thank you very much. I see Councilmember Barksdale already has his hand up. So we'll start with you. If anybody else would like to speak, please put your hand up. Councilmember Barksdale.
All right, thank you, Mayor. First, I just want to say I really appreciate that staff is looking at how to incorporate equity into our budgeting process. We've definitely talked about equity quite a bit on the council, so really glad to see that get into one of our main documents of one artifacts. So just a couple things. I think just given the limitation with the data currently, operational data in terms of the data that we currently have, and I know that we're collecting data now through the survey, I just would suggest, in addition to the metrics that you currently have, that you also incorporate a bit of qual in engaging with, to the extent possible, stakeholders from groups that are underrepresented directly, and that may be through nonprofits that best represent those groups, who we normally don't hear from, just to make sure we have a good understanding of what their experience is in Bellevue and relative to the services. And then I think, and I don't know if this is the time, are the principles something that we can discuss, like modifying slightly? There's one part that I think I'd like to add equity or equitable into those principles. So I don't know if that's doable. Just the time.
Sure, we'll take any feedback that you have from Councilmember Barksdale.
Yes.
Okay. It could go in either place. There's one that talks about long range, affordable, and sustainable. I'm just giving a brief part, and equitable could be part of that. Or commitment to, and there's that section there. It could go in there. So just wanted to, I think it's important to have that in the principles, especially since we're going to incorporate it into the budget process. And then my only question is, for that last principle, what types of services sort of come to mind as we think about when we say we're going to only proceed with quality services and stop providing services where we can't provide quality services? What's the nature of the services that we might consider ending or cutting?
Certainly, Mayor, I can step in and answer that question.
Great.
First of all, thank you, Councilmember Barksdale, for your feedback. I really appreciate it, especially the comments around the nonprofits. So thank you for that. Very helpful to us. When it comes to that last principle, Evan, if you could pop back to the slide with the, that way I can read it out to all. The principle at the bottom reads, if expenditure reductions are needed, service elimination is preferred over poor or marginal quality programs. In the history of Bellevue, I think there's been a couple of times when we've actually implemented that, and some of those services came back in future budget cycles as the economy got better. So the only one that I am aware of is back in the Great Recession, we made a choice to eliminate the bicycle patrol in the police department. As revenues came back online, that service came back to the city. So that's probably the only thing I can think of off the top of my head, but it is something we look at. If we're at a place where our services are no longer providing quality programs, I think that's something we should be thinking about. So does that answer your question, sir?
It does. Thank you. I guess my only question would be that making sure that we're not cutting, or that we think hard about if we're cutting any sort of human services that are necessary for our community.
Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it.
Next, we have Councilmember Lee, followed by Stokes, Deputy Mayor Newenhouse, and Councilmember Zahn. Councilmember Lee, I think you're muted.
I apologize. Yes, now I'm unmuted. I appreciate the outline for the process, budget one process. I think what I heard, I feel the most important, and also something that we need to have, especially when we know the data we've got is based on the census. And I think we all on the council has been emphasizing matrix, information. I think that's important. The best way to make sure that we follow this principle of how we deliver services toward everybody in the community on an equitable basis is to have lots of good data information and its impact, to our community. I like that a lot, so I appreciate you emphasizing that. I do have a question. Of course, everything else will come, after we just starting the budget process. So I hope we have plenty of opportunity to talk about some specifics. You mentioned Tacoma and Port of Seattle in terms of, is it as a best practice or comparison? I'm just curious. I don't know what you are referring to. So maybe you can speak a little bit about the choice, what else that you can use for our purpose, and what is it that you are using to compare with Tacoma and Port of Seattle?
Certainly, Councilmember Lee, I can step in there, and Evan, I'll have to ship this over to you in just a minute. If you could go back to the equity slide, I think that would be helpful. Councilmember Lee, there's, different jurisdictions are at different levels of maturity into relation as to how they're thinking about using equity in a decision-making tool. Both City of Tacoma and the Port of Seattle were two jurisdictions that we were able to find that did a nice job mapping data, which helped us create the ability to have a visual and not just words on a piece of paper. With that, I'm going to ship the rest of that answer over to Mr. Phillips to pick up the rest of that.
Yeah, the thing I would like to emphasize is one of the things that we picked up on from the port in their presentation of their equity lens in their initial stages, because I think Tacoma is probably in a more mature place than either where we're at or the port. And what the port has been doing as part of their initial development of their equity lens is establishing a good baseline. So I think that's one of the things that we took away is, we don't want to be hard charging with this equity lens. We want to make sure this is a good, earnest first attempt because we really do want this to work. And in order to really build a solid foundation, we're going to need the data to try to figure that out and figure out where our gaps are in the data. So I think that was one of the lessons that we took away from the port. And I believe Tacoma did something similar in terms of establishing a baseline. So that's why this attempt is a little bit more limited and it's a test. We don't know if this is going to work, but it's an earnest first attempt, and really building that foundation and getting that baseline knowledge, I think, is one of the main things that we took away from their experience.
Thank you. Very good.
Okay, next we have Councilmember Stokes, followed by Deputy Mayor, Councilmember Zahn, Robertson, and myself. And I just want to reiterate that we're only about a third, if that much, way through this presentation. And we are going to stop 2 more times for questions. And of course, at the end, we'll have an opportunity for more questions. So Councilmember Stokes, go ahead.
Yeah, first off, to add on to what Councilmember Lee said, I'm just make it clear, Tacoma and the port are in addition to King County City. So sounds like a really good another look at how we're doing this, and I appreciate that. There are really 2 things I want to focus on. One is I'm really excited about having the equity issue in this, and I assume we're going to take an approach. We look individually at the budgets as we go, budget to items as we go through, and we'll look at their, their impact and the applications and the positive impact on each of the items. But We also, I think it's important to have the lens on looking at the impact of equity and inclusion and how this all works together has to be applied to the whole also. And I assume that's the way you're approaching it. It's looking at the different pieces and then looking at the whole piece together. Is that correct? Would that be a good
Folks, yes.
assumption?
Yes, it's a very good assumption. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And the other, I liked where the criteria. On that one, I think the one they're all very good, but the one that's really exciting to me is that, which I always try to apply this when we're going forward, particularly after all the stuff we've gone through recently, is realizing the opportunities holistically. And that includes opportunities for equity, not just piece by piece, but how do we make the whole thing as it comes together and the stuff we work in the city equitable all across the board. So again, I'm very excited that you've the way you translated this and put this forward is really what I've been hoping we would get, and really excited about working on that. Otherwise, just great presentation so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Newhouse.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I too am excited about the way this has been set up and structured for over the next year, and I fully expect we're going to have a good conversation tonight and at the retreat and well beyond that. On the outreach piece, I would encourage you to also, and I just feel like we're losing sight of this too often, is to do also announce this process on the My Bellevue app or do a push notification. I feel like we're losing track of that more and more of a communication tool to reach residents. And then I just had a follow-up question on, and some good questions on the equity lens. And as Councilmember Barksdale rightly pointed out, it's something very top of mind and important to this entire council. I'm just curious on, since this is a test, Evan, how will we measure success on this? How will we know if we got it right? Because it is a test. And I'm just kind of curious, and we might not have, the answers until after the process is over or after the budget process is over and be able to analyze what we got right and what we didn't get right. But I'm just curious what I guess levers or how we're going to measure this at the end that equity lens actually helped us get to where we wanted to go in terms of very equitable budget process.
I can step in to start, Nev, if you want to pick something else. I think Councilmember Nieuwenhuis, Deputy Mayor Nieuwenhuis, as we approach this process, you're right, it will be difficult to tell, but I think the test will be, did we use the data to help make informed decisions? Was it a part of our toolbox that helped us get to a decision making? And I think that in the end will be the test. I think since it's limited in its scope, we won't be able to answer, did it wholeheartedly work for every piece of this pie? That wouldn't be realistic. But I do think it's, will we use it? Did it get used? Was it valuable information? I think that's probably the biggest test. Evan, is there anything you'd answer to that?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I would maybe ask is, or I would answer in addition to that is, I think there are ways we might be able to ascertain how much communities felt engaged. Were people engaging with this content when it was presented? Was the way in which it presented, obviously to Tony's point, was it used, but are we communicating our findings appropriately? So I think that's an area where there's opportunities for feedback as well.
Great. Well, thanks, Evan. Thanks, Tony.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Zahn.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate, thank you so much, Michael and Tony, for the presentation. It's very helpful to get a sense for the budget one process, how it's going to work, the pieces that are the same as we've done in past years. And then I appreciate all of the conversations so far from my colleagues related to equitable community and how we might look at using an equity lens. As an 18-year employee for the Port of Seattle, I'm excited that this is an area where the kind of work that the Port's been doing around equity, that they may be able to be a partnership with that. And I guess I would just say to my colleagues that, the equity lens is one tool within the toolbox. And to the deputy mayor's point about how we're going to measure success, and then to, Councilmember Stokes and Barksdale and Councilmember Lee, it is about mapping the data, establishing a baseline, and then we have to establish goals. That's how we're going to tell if we're making a difference or not, because at the end of the day, it's about equity in action. So I would like to make sure that as we are looking at the budget, that we are making sure that we have the internal staff availability, and also looking at, are we doing equity training, surveys and assessments, listening sessions, so that we really understand what we're trying to do, and that this is not a performative equity lens, but we're actually doing the work of making sure that we're embedding equity, and the lens itself is just one tool within a way that we're doing business, where we're looking at how are the nonprofits doing, who's actually getting work with the city of Bellevue in our contracts, in our goods and services, and our procurement. So as we move forward with the continual economic recovery and the workforce development work we've started talking about, that we're looking holistically at our budget and how we're making sure that we're actually supporting the equity work. So we end up with equity in action, with establishing baselines and goals and moving forward. I appreciate the holistic view and the long range viewpoint of how we make sure that we have a sustainable budget, and grounding in this work is going to be key. So thank you very much. And I'm excited to move forward in this work together. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Robertson.
Thanks. Yeah, I love the budget one process. And I'm glad to be going through it again with all of you. So I support the process. I support adding the equity lens. I think that's great. I know that and I know this data is just for sample, but I think there's lots of different ways to slice and dice equity and the data about it. The sample map there shows where we spend money and which neighborhoods get more. And there's also the way of looking at which neighborhoods have more people who are in need and making sure that we spend money there. We used to have, I think it was called the NIS program called Neighborhood Improvement, something or other, where we, in addition to the neighborhood enhancement program, we would look at neighborhoods that needed a little more care and feeding, people where they had folks that were more in need, and we would specifically target investments to that. So things like that, I think, would be really, really helpful. And speaking of equity, if the governor actually signs House Bill 1769, we're going to have a little bit of money from the community council that we no longer need to fund. Maybe we could use that as a down payment towards equity for the entire city. So couple of other comments. One is, and I don't know that we've always done this, but when we first adopted the budget one process, we had an above the line, below the line funding for each of the areas, where there was a heavy black line in the middle of the page. And everything above the line could be funded, everything below couldn't, but it was prioritized in case additional money came in. I really want to get to using that again, because it's really helpful as a policymaker when you're struggling with the budget to see, okay, if I'm going to add more revenue, what gets pulled up? If we're going to make some cuts, what gets pulled down? Also, as a council, if we have a different priority than the list that has the line in it, how do we change the priority? I think that's really a very useful tool for the council, as well as the public, so they can see trade-offs. I think we should do similar, have similar information about what are the options for additional resources. So, and I know we're going to talk about parks, but for example, if the council wanted to do a new parks capital levy or a parks O&M levy, what then could be pulled above the line with those sources of funds. So I think that we need to make sure that we, as one of my former colleagues used to say, we got to have uses and we got to have sources and we have to match them up so that it works. So having those all really laid out for the council so that we can, when it comes down to the end of the process in November and December, we will really know what we have, what we're passing, and it will be a very thoughtful budget and one where we understand and the public understands the trade-offs, because there's not enough money to fund everything. And we want to make sure we fund the things that the people of Bellevue value. So thank you.
Thank you. So, I really appreciate the equity lens. I think that's spot on. I hate to say this, but I'd really like a sustainability lens in addition. I think those two things are super important moving forward in every single thing that we do. And I'd like to start today with that, just like we're adding in the equity lens. So I'd like council to consider the feasibility of adding that to this budget process. But I like where we're going, and I will let you continue, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to move on to back to Evan, and he's going to bring us a quick update on something that we talk about in the newspaper every day, which is how is inflation going? So we're going to change from process into a little bit of substance and talk about inflation. Evan, back to you, please.
Yes, so this will be brief, and I do want to provide a brief update, as Tony said, before we dive into the early look general forecast, because everything will feed off of this inflation conversation. And it is just the one slide, but I do want to make sure that there's also, if you have questions, that there's time available for that as well. So I do want the slide, let me just orient you with what you're looking at here. So this chart represents roughly 30 years of inflation data for the Seattle metro area. So there are peaks, there are valleys, but generally speaking, on average, the metro area would see somewhere between 2 and 3% of year-over-year inflation. There are some notable peaks. There is, right before the Great Recession, there was a high of 6.2% in 2008. And the last peak should be familiar to all of us, experiencing supply chain issues in 2021, peaking at 6.3%. And that is the information that we received in July of last year. You'll also see a shaded blue triangle on the right-hand side of your chart. That is trying to communicate the huge amount of uncertainty that we have in what we're expecting inflation to be next year. So it could be anywhere between as low as 4%, which is still a very high number based on historical averages, or potentially as high as 7%. So that is a pretty substantial variation there. And we did want to highlight that there is a lot of uncertainty. This is based on the best information that we have today. That yellow star is actually really our guiding star for the time being. It is what we believe to be the most accurate, and that yellow star resides at the 5% mark. So 5% year-over-year inflation is what we really do think is the most likely scenario at this point today. And I really do have to emphasize that that is today's number. Tomorrow's number might be completely different from the number that we provide to you 3 months from now. And at the end of the day, the number that we'll use in July doesn't come out until July. So for the sake of budget planning and our forecast, we've assumed a 5% number because we believe that's the best that we have today based on conversations that we've had with King County by using IHS Markit private data, as well as reading what the State Economic Forecast Council is putting out there as well. So we're creating a composite of all of these different varied sources, but at the end of the day, everyone's taking their best guess. And with the amount of variability there is with supply chain issues, energy prices, geopolitical instability, obviously the war in Ukraine, there is a lot of volatility in this space, and it's leading to a lot of uncertainties. But generally speaking, the best answer that most sources have today is that we're going to see year-over-year inflation of about 5%. So just to ground the conversation a little bit, because I know this is abstract percentiles, what does a percent increase in inflation mean, let alone 4 or 7%? So with every 1% increase in inflation, that corresponds to roughly a $1.2 million increase in personnel expenditures just to the general fund, let alone to all other funds in the cities. But since we're spending a lot of time talking about the general fund tonight, just know that every incremental 1% increase, again, equates to $1.2 million roughly of personnel expenditures. So as that number ticks up from 4 to 5 to 6 to hopefully not 7% year over year inflation, it just exacerbates the current structural gap that we have between revenues and expenditures. So that is the context of the conversation that we're going into tonight. And that's why we're leading off with inflation, because so much of what we're talking about tonight feeds off of this initial problem. And it's something that we're all experiencing. As Tony said at the top, this is something we're reading about in the newspaper, you're experiencing at the grocery store, you're experiencing at the pump. If you bought a new car recently, as I have, you're experiencing it throughout all daily life. And it's really fundamental, not to just how we live, but how the city budgets going forward. So that's the elephant in the room, and we wanted to call it out at the top. So with that being said, I said there would be an opportunity for questions, comments, concerns at this point before we move on. So I leave the floor open to those questions.
Please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. I'm not seeing any, so let's keep moving.
All righty, I will turn the presentation over to Tony to talk about the general fund early look forecast.
Thank you yet again for having us this evening, Council. Here's one of those stops in the check-in list so you can see where we are on our agenda. We've clicked off 2 of the 5 items in our agenda, so that is good. We have some meaty topics ahead of us: the general fund forecast, capital investments, and the park's long-range planning effort yet to go. So I'll bring this slide back in a little bit. So talking about the general fund forecast, our goal today is for staff to provide some background and some potential future scenarios. And I'm going to reiterate that those are potential future scenarios because we've used proxies to kind of give us some impact of understanding. We'll be looking at that over the 6-year period. We are specifically seeking feedback on principles, actions for considerations, overall questions of curiosity that will assist the city manager in developing his budget. That will come back to you in the fall. So with that, Evan, next slide, please. I know we've been down this path before. We've been talking about it pretty steadily for a couple of budget cycles. And in the middle of that, we had a pandemic. So I'm going to kind of go back in history a bit, just to remind us where we've been. So like other governments, the city has faced and will continue to face an ongoing structural deficits where expenditure growth will outstrip revenue growth in the general fund. There are 2 main drivers in that discussion, one on the revenue and balance side, and I have a slide that follows this that will talk more about the revenue and balance to give a little bit of grounding on those revenue sources, and the other on the expenditure side, where we have this wonderful urbanization and growth that's occurring in the city, and that will require more new and enhanced services. So that's going to impact that expenditure side of the equation. Moving on to the next slide, let me spend a minute or 2 talking about our revenue pie and about how it is impacted. So you kind of have an idea of why we kind of have this revenue imbalance at the city. So I'm going to start talking from the left-hand side of the page. On that 5 pie chart, we've seen it several times in the past over time. If you take the sales tax, that is the 5 major components of the general fund. If you take the sales tax at 29% and the B&O taxes at 17%, you get a total of 46. That is important because 46% of our current general fund is being driven by our 2 most economically sensitive revenue sources. When times are good, they get bigger. When times are not so great or we're heading into struggles, they're the first ones that get impacted. Just as a point of reference, in 2018, if you added those 2 slices together, you got 40%. And I went back and looked. So back at about the 2013-ish timeframe was the first time we brought this pie to you. So it was a long time ago trying to understand our revenue cycles. Back then it was 38%. So over the past while, 7-8 years, we've really seen this economic piece that's happened in the city come to our actual revenue split of the pie. You'll notice property taxes usually runs around 17%. For 2023, we're forecasting them at 17%, and I'll get to the other 2 slices. So let's kind of head over to the bullet points on the right, some speaking notes to talk about those revenue pieces. So first of all, sales tax. Right now, the biggest driver of our sales tax growth has to do with development and construction that's happening primarily when I look at the cranes across the city in downtown and Bell Red. I know I have a few cranes in some other places as well, but I primarily see them in downtown and Bell Red. That sales tax construction makes up about 30% of our total sales tax. The last piece of information that I saw coming out of development services was, I believe 2021 had a record permit year of something like 1.4-ish, give or take. billion in permits. That is a big number. And that driving of that development is what's bringing one-time sales tax money into that part of the pie. The other part of the pie that I think is important when it comes to sales tax is our retail sales. Retail sales makes up about 30% of our total sales tax. Retail sales is kind of our bread and butter of sales tax, right? That's when you go to wherever you want to buy and buy your durable goods. You're going to buy your hats and your coats and your shoes and your sofa and your chairs and your dining room set and whatever else your durable goods that you're purchasing out there. Right now, retail sales is growing at about 4% year over year. And that is actually fantastic. It's higher than it's been in the past. In the past, it's been closer to 3. So to see it at 4 is really wonderful to see. My only struggle is I have inflation coming in something higher than 5. So even though my retail sales portion of sales tax is growing really well at 4%, I'm not quite getting over that inflationary step at that 5% mark. So sales tax primarily driven right now by one-time construction, and that is big money coming in, there's no doubt. And our forecast continues a lot of development to continue. B&O taxes, that is a piece of the pie that actually grows fairly well and does very well in relation to our expenditure line. We've had a lot of new business come into the city. We've had just expansion of existing businesses. So that's doing well, but only makes up 17% of my total revenue pie, right? So here's a piece that does well against my expenditure line, and yet it only makes up 17%. Property taxes, a little less, again, a 17% or a little less than 20%. Property taxes, we all know, grow at 1% with council approval plus new construction. When I'm looking at inflation at 5, even if inflation comes in at 3, property tax is not keeping pace. Heading up to miscellaneous revenues, I'm going to skip utility taxes, go to miscellaneous revenues. Primarily, they come in around CPI or the rate of inflation. So it pretty much matches the rate of inflation. And then you have utility taxes. They're based on rates for the most part. And I would say in the last decade, they've grown anywhere between 2 and 3% annually. And that's mainly because even if rates have increased, we've lost landlines, which is a telephone tax that's kind of evaporating. And we also have the issue where your cell phone voice packages, I don't know how many have a voice package left, but if you do, that is taxable. If you have a data package, that is not taxable. So we're seeing some decreases still in the utility taxes that's holding that growth rate down. Challenge is, as I look at our revenue pie, we've got all the right tools in the toolbox. In our current environment, we're really struggling to have them perform at the level of where we're seeing our expenditures growth at. All right. I'm going to move on from there and take a step back and say, since we've talked about this for a while, what have we done about the fact that we know we have a structural deficit and things are coming? So I've framed it into 2 different pieces, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, because we had a big blip in the middle. Before the pandemic, council had built reserves for 2 reasons. Built them for the sake of ensuring that if recession came, we had more dollars in the coffers to help us weather those storms. And I think that is one of the great reasons the city fared really well coming out of the pandemic. Even though we did take some ongoing reductions, we did fairly well compared to some of our other cities that I've seen. We also had the 1% councilman property tax and fire inspection fees were implemented. And then on the expenditure side, we spent quite a bit of time working with employees to implement some out-year strategies to impact health costs. Next slide, please. Pandemic occurred, and it brought us an opportunity to take some swift action to balance the budget. What happened in the 21-22 budget is we actually reduced our ongoing costs by about $8 million in total. It was done through 2 pieces. First is cost containment, everything from reductions in temporary help to consultants to non-discretionary travel training, et cetera. You name the line item and it probably got an impact. There are areas across the city that due to that cost containment are really struggling to meet their surge capacity. They've now been limited in their ability to meet that surge capacity that's needed. We also implemented a more reactive response to maintenance. So less watering and mowing of certain areas of the city parks, more reactive response to non-safety repairs that need to be made. Those all happened. You add those things together, you get to the $8 million. We also implemented some one-time bridge structures, and we had some modest increase in revenues, and you can look at those at the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a forecast that starts to look like this. And before I jump in and talk about the $3 million in the blue line and the green line, let me give you some of the big assumptions. There's 4 or 5 big assumptions that are impacting both the green line and the blue line. The green line is your revenue line, the blue line is your expenditure line. And as we've been talking about, we knew those lines were going to cross. And this is probably one of the first years that we're saying we're starting the budget process in a deficit position. So green line, major assumptions in the green line. We are continuing a strong sales tax due to development. I'm not sure we're going to always see $1.4, $1.6 billion in permits, but we're saying the cranes are staying for a while, and we're going to continue to see that strong sales tax throughout this forecast. That changes, the green line would change. We're also saying we're going to continue to see strong B&O taxes. That's still going to continue. So those volatile, our more volatile revenue sources are still going to be strong as we head out this forecast. On the expenditure side, the blue line, the major assumptions are that we have included Fire Station 10 that will open in 2023-ish, and it will incur some ongoing costs. Some of those costs were already budgeted in 2022. The rest will come in 2023, and this forecast assumes that. It assumes that 5% inflation number. It does include the fact that our 21-22 cost reductions will continue. So we've already included those in that blue line. The blue line also includes a modest growth. And when I mean modest, it's like a 0.3% of expenditures modest. And it's really about saying we know there are some near-term needs, but that line isn't really going to get us kind of the extreme growth we're seeing and the extreme needs we're seeing across the city. So what this says that currently we are starting with a $3 million gap in 2023, and it grows as you look at the gap between 2024 and 2028. If we do nothing, if we just ride it out like it is, we think that gap will continue to just widen over time. In order to change the trajectory of that gap, not one of the lines, but of the gap itself, the choice would be if we did ongoing actions to solve that 23 budget item, if we made ongoing actions. So either we decreased expenditures ongoing or increased revenues ongoing by $3 million. 2024, that gap between that you see in 24 would decrease by $3 million because it was ongoing money. 2025 would decrease by $3 million. And you can go up the line saying every year you would have an impact of $3 million if you took ongoing actions. On the other hand, if you took one-time actions and we solved the budget process with a series of one-time actions in 2023, that would not have any impact on the trajectory of the gap. All right. I know that's slightly complicated, but I think it's important as we talk about feedback and how we think about what's important coming forward. We're at a place where we need to start thinking about those ongoing actions from a fiscal sustainability perspective. As I mentioned, the blue line probably does not have enough in it for the extreme growth that we're seeing. So what staff has done is we have developed 2 scenarios, and I am very clear that they are scenarios. One that would show what a 2% increase in positions would look like, and one that would be a 4% increase in positions. And our purpose in showing this is just to show the impact of what it would take and how does that change the gap. So Evan, could you go to the next slide, please? So if we had a 2% change in our FTE growth, full-time equivalent or position growth, it would add about 19 positions to the city, to the general fund. And you will see by the gray line, we will have increased the blue line by $2.5 million, and the gap in 2023 would turn into about a $5.5 million gap. So what this says is if we need more than what we currently have in the blue line, it's going to make the gap bigger and more challenging to solve. If you go to the next slide, we also ran a series of numbers at the 4%. So if you wanted to add another 2% of FTEs or another 19 for a total of 38 positions over the blue line, we would now add another $2.5 million, and our total gap between the purple line and the green line would be $8 million. So as we talk about the growth of the city and what's important, the more we add, just the bigger the gap we're going to be able to solve. Our purpose here was really to show for context what increases to respond to the extreme growth would look like. We chose these 2 scenarios primarily because they didn't really seem as proxies out of the realm of possibilities. When we're talking about the impact and the feedback we've received from the community regarding public safety, planning initiatives, and all the other related internal infrastructure that would be needed to support those things. So as we are thinking about how we move forward, thinking about where that blue line needs to go will impact our the gap that we're talking about. Again, it's a scenario. It's to provide context and information. We are not suggesting one way or the other. It's purely for context and information. So moving on to the next page, please. So the question is, well, what are we going to do about it? So I think we really have the same three choices we've had for a while, which is we can reduce expenditures, we can increase revenues, or we can use reserves. So as we're talking about the balance, the financial deficits we'll see this year, those are kind of the choices ahead of us. I've got slides on each of those and we'll hit them pretty quickly. Reducing expenditures. I think any remaining choices will be challenging and difficult, and the trade-offs will be difficult. I'm not sure that there's any easy decisions ahead of anybody this year, but expenditure reductions will be difficult. The forecast continues to take those 21-22 reductions that are already in place. We know we have growing needs of the community, and maybe we'll get lucky and inflation will come in less than everyone is forecasting. If not, it will just make the gap bigger. So reducing expenditures is one option to think about how do we bring that gap to zero. The other option we have, which is just as challenging, there's no easy answers here either, which would be to increase revenues for operations. Again, no easy answers. We've split this slide into two buckets. One that looks at things that were already in place that councilmanically can be adjusted because they're already in place, and those things that might be new. You can see the list here. There are several others that are just that are smaller items that are in among others, and if you would like me to go through those, I certainly can. Again, no easy answers, a challenging place to be, but increased revenues is another option. And the third option, which we talked about, is to use fund balance. Yet again, it's one-time funding, and so it doesn't create a sustainable path for us. Might buy us some time, but it doesn't really create a long-term sustainable path. This is our ending fund balance. The books haven't closed yet for 2021. They're just cleaning them up now. I expect them to close in the next, I don't know, weekish, maybe less. I don't think these numbers are grossly wrong. So again, if we do nothing, we bleed reserves over time. When we take actions, we change the trajectory of that ending fund balance. So our feedback we're looking for this evening is, as we set up a discussion around how do we think about bringing back a balanced preliminary budget, do you have feedback? Do you have questions? Do you have actions for consideration for the city manager? So Mayor, I turn this back over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to go through the list, the same list I had before, starting with Councilmember Barksdale, followed by Councilmember Lee Stokes and Deputy Mayor Noonhouse.
All right, thank you, Mayor. I really appreciate the overview. I guess my only, I'm taking in the information. I really appreciate the list of options. I don't have a formula yet that I have in mind, but I did have one question, Tony, that you might remember when right before joining council, I had a question around the role of nightlife. And as I looked up the economic benefit or fiscal impact for larger cities, of course, which I know aren't necessarily comparable. I mean, New York City from 2016 had 35.1 billion in total economic output, and DC had $562 million in fiscal impact. And so I guess I'm curious, not for tonight, but just what that might look like. And I don't know if it fits into one of these options. I wasn't quite sure which one it might fit in, but I feel like that, especially as we're starting to get back out, what that might look like and how that might fit into the list of options. I guess the question I do have is, given the current tools that we have, and you said they're not really performing as we need them to keep up, at least keep up with inflation, if there are any benchmark cities, and not for tonight necessarily, but if we could look at how other cities are, what policies that we might consider.
Good feedback, Councilmember Barksdale. Thank you for that. I will do some thinking on the nightlife issue currently. From my memory, in 2021, about of our sales tax that came in the door, Less than 10% was for food and accommodations, which is where I think I'd see that nightlife impact. I'm getting a nodding of the head from Evan, so I've got to be close. So it was less than 10%. That was in 2021. We should go back to 2019 and see what that percentage was back pre-pandemic, I would suggest. And nightlife would impact both sales tax and business and occupation tax primarily, is where we'd see that come in. I certainly can do some thinking on that. As for benchmark cities, I will certainly go out and do some looking. One of the challenges I think we as the city of Bellevue might have is that we are a very fast growing city within the state of Washington with our tax laws that we have here. So I'll have to do some thinking on that. That's a very good question. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is a very challenging presentation and perspective, based on current tools that we use. I think this is a time for innovation, like we talk about. And government, it needs to also innovate. Traditionally, we don't. So we're looking for tools, other cities that may have other examples, like, Councilmember Barksdale mentioned. So we need to look at what tools other people use. And also, not just any tool, that I believe the tool has to be applicable to our city, right? I mean, this is what we are able to influence the people either living here or coming here or who are here. And so we need to do something that's not traditional. And I don't believe that, government is the answer for everything either. We're seeing that happening. Amazon is coming in, and there are other major corporations, and they're doing well, faring well. And they are, I don't want to use the word profiting from us, but they are a part of our city that provide them with their ability to grow, right? And when they do, they cannot just take the profit and just pocket it in and just go away. They have to participate in helping the city's growth in all ways, including our financial situation. So we have nonprofits, we have corporate citizens, we have other means to generate revenue. So, what I think, Tony, you laid out very well is we are basically talking about revenue and expenditure, and we are constrained traditionally. Revenue is what we got, and the expenditure keep on changing, keep on growing, because our lifestyle changed, the people change, our needs changed, our community is changing. So we need to be looking at how and where do we going to get the revenue more creatively, not just depending on traditional, whatever we have described, sales or property or utility, whatever. It's got to be, creative. So I think we need to explore that. We really need to. That's one thing. But not just based on the cities, not based on just the residents, who have to be taxed, but there are other ways. So what is it? I think we need to explore, at least think about it. At least we need to converse with them. We need to have a conversation. Okay, that has to be done. That's the revenue side. In the expenditure side, I think we also need to be more, same thing. Our pattern has changed. Our way of, things living is changed. So what do we need is change. We're talking about equity. That's a new thing. How is it going to impact us? And to do that, we need to look at matrix data, information, see it's relevant to our city, and how does it, we have to generate, pay for the things that we are prone to need. To have the expenditure to cover those things. And I think that's what Jerry Mayor was talking about too, sustainability. To sustain, we have to know what is going to be the norm, what is going to be what people want. And then, we have to find resources to see how we can satisfy that. So it's not just a one-shot deal, two-shot deal, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, but it's longer term. And that needs to be a collaborative conversation, cooperation with everybody who has a role, has a stake in our city. So I think this is what we really need to do over the long term. But of course, there's a short-term situation. Well, that's something we have to also respond. But so there are two pieces of it. But I think for the long run, we really need to do those things. I was just hoping. That's why.
Councilmember Lee, can you wrap up, please?
That's it. This is what I want to say. It's, need to be more creative, innovative, talking to the partners we haven't talked to or have not contributed before. Maybe there's opportunity that we all can,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, very interesting. I appreciate Councilmember Lee's kind of coverage there. It's too bad we can't go back and pick up those 6 or so years of 1% that we left on the table years ago. But things, as he indicated, things have changed. And I think what is, the dilemma is we're trying to play catch up, and it's kind of a, chicken and the egg type thing. And I think that I'm we can talk a lot about, we get into the theories and all this, but what you've laid out is very good. And there are a lot of questions, of course, that have to go along to that. And that's why we're going to have a lot more sessions. But it seems to me that the trouble is in this is that how do we keep up with development? And it's difficult, particularly with our constraints in taxes and everything else. We're not actually set up to really be a great successful city or government because of the way the tax structure is. So we have to work with that. And we have to be, I think, more, we do have to work more with our companies coming in, because again, development doesn't pay for itself, at least certainly not for a long time. So we have all these problems. I think, though, that we're on the right path of this, and I appreciate this. And doing innovation, finding ways to generate more income. And as I said, this playing catch up is always so difficult. And the dilemma we have is based on the opportunities and the great possibilities in front of us that we have. In order to get there, we have to perform very high as a city. And we can't keep cutting back on, cutting the weeds on the road. We can't cut back on providing services, because and being a city that is really offering all of these things up is the reason we're getting all these people here. So it's a circular thing, and we're kind of behind the movement on this. But I think what we're setting up, and I think what's going to be interesting in the conversations that go along, is we're actually talking about and looking at ways to utilize and to get more leverage out of our funding and the things we do, the creative economies we've talked about. Yes, we need more nightlife. We need more things going on in Bellevue that get people here to spend money and to come to Bellevue. And playing catch up with that is always difficult, because you have to put investments in. You have to invest before you can get returns. And so it's a real conundrum in a sense. But I think overall, I like the approach, and I think we're going the right direction. I hope we get more information on exactly what some of these overall themes are, what they're costing, how can we balance things better, and how can we continue to have a strong forward-looking focus in our providing services in the government and the way the city goes, and at the same time actually be able to pay for that. Because if we can't do those things, we're not going to have any more money. Money's not going to come in if we're not providing the services people want. So it's
Councilmember Stokes, can you please wrap up?
So I think that's the big combination thing we have to look at. And again, I'm looking forward to as we move down these pieces on that. But I want to keep that in mind. We have a great opportunity, great future. How are we going to pay for it?
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Great comments so far, and I'll try to stay within the 3 minutes, but certainly a lot of questions. So first, I'd like to go back just for a second, and I'll ask all my questions up front and then allow the answers to come after that. On the inflation rate, I'm just curious if there are any actions that we took or any key learnings that we might want to consider now that have not been discussed so far, since we have been in a similar circumstance once before. That's one question. And then also, I'm wondering also, Tony, some of the assumptions that are being made in terms of this forecast as well. I look back at the city of Seattle, for example, and from like 2012 to 2018, they saw a 48% increase in revenues into the city. Now, why is that? I'm not sure. It could be somewhat of an effect of first the jobs came, high-tech explosion, then a lot of the ancillary services came on top of that. You know, all the services, you know, the restaurants, the bars, the dry cleaning, maybe even the nightlife as well. So is it possible, and again, going back to your assumptions, Tony, that some of these things, maybe you're not being quite as aggressive enough, if we could be kind of in a, what's a good example? Kind of like South Lake Union, for example, where we saw a complete explosion of a complete like ecosystem to serve not only just Amazon, but all of those businesses in that area. Do you potentially see that same type of equation here in Bellevue? But I'd love to understand a little bit more in terms of the assumptions being made. And then finally, I think it'd just be great if we can make a commitment as a council to try and get away as much as possible from the one-time funding sources. I think that's really going to behoove us as we move forward. Yes, I think those are great things to utilize if we go through extreme emergencies or a pandemic, obviously, you know, and I think that we should rightly use them during that time. But I think as a city, we should try to, as much as possible, get away from dipping in consistently into those contingency funds unless absolutely necessary. That might not happen during this budget process, but certainly I'd like to see it as a goal. So I'm almost at my 3 minutes, so I'll stop there and allow you to answer. Thank you.
Certainly, Deputy Mayor. I have one quick question back to you before I answer. I missed the years when I was taking notes from the Seattle piece. You gave me some years and I missed them. I apologize.
Yeah, that was from 2012 to 2018.
2018. I will go back and do some research on the city of Seattle. I do know they implemented a few new taxes during that time, like the soda pop tax and whatnot, but I'll go back and do some research into what was there, because I think that's an important piece. So, but let's talk about the other two questions that I think I can have a better chance answering. The inflation rate, and do we get any key learnings? Evan, can you go back to the inflation chart for me really quickly?
Of course.
It's a ways back. I apologize for that.
Oh, of course.
The blur. So here's the inflation chart. So what we have historically seen, at least in the last 30 years, and I think we could go back farther, I'm sure, and find some other trends, but at least in the last 30 years, which I think is fairly recent, when we've had a super high inflation, which you saw in 2008, we went down to zero or very low inflation the following years. So it's a little different environment that we're in today. So I can tell you, and gosh, I don't want to date myself too heavily here, but I was trying to, purchase that first house back in the early 80s. And at that point, inflation was not too far off what we're seeing right now. It was up in the sixes, pretty, for those of you who might remember that. It was up in that same spot. The only challenge is at the same time, interest rates at that time were also really high, because I was looking at a 10% fixed year mortgage back in that time frame to buy that first home that I was trying to buy. Here we've got a different situation, and this is just one. Again, I'm sitting in uncharted territory, which I'm relying on the economists that are a whole lot smarter than I to help kind of chart that course a bit. Here we're looking at an environment where inflation is back up in the sixes, and yet our interest rates are still, our 30-year mortgage rate is still somewhere around the threes. The Fed's going to have to step in at some point and help us out. As to what that looks like, that's a little beyond my skill set as to how we would think about that. So lessons learned, I think the sad part is we're in a little uncharted territory again. So it's something we're going to have to watch. I am hopeful that something good will happen in the next couple months and bring that star of 5% down closer to 4. That would be the ultimate good news. When I look at kind of where we are with the Ukraine and the global fuel that's out there, I'm not sure I'm quite seeing it yet. But so I think that's kind of the inflationary question. It's more of a long story of history than it is actually lessons learned. When it comes to the assumptions we've got in the forecast, we worked really hard on our sales tax primarily and our B&O to really have those reflect the growth we're seeing right now. We're back to our pre-pandemic levels coming out of 2021. So we're back to those 2019 plus levels that we saw back then. So that's really great news. We're still assuming this really strong development that's occurring in downtown and Bellevue. We're not seeing a pullback of that area. So those we're still seeing fairly strong, and we're still continuing to see B&O growth running in the 5 to 6% year-over-year growth. Again, super strong. Those two most volatile revenue assumptions. What it doesn't include is some sort of a new tax or something in there. We are looking, I think I would tell you that I feel fairly confident in our out year numbers. And if anything, we might be a tad on the aggressive side when I look at my neighboring cities. I usually bring you a chart for that, and I did not bring that to you tonight, but I will certainly bring that to you in the future to help answer that question.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Zahn, followed by Councilmember Robertson.
Yes, thank you, Tony. You know, these are tough times that we're facing, and we're going to be making some tough policy choices. I was just thinking that we are all in the same boat, that we are in uncharted territory where we're going to have to figure out how to lead amongst the uncertainty of what is the inflation we should be carrying. You know, the construction market just released their quarterly projections, and you know, they are polishing that magic ball, trying to figure out projections. But right now there's a lot of uncertainty, whether it's domestic or the war in Europe and how it might impact overall supply chain as well as labor shortages. So I do think that what we're doing is really important of looking at all of the potential funding sources. I like comments made already about benchmarking other cities, looking at what they're doing. And then when I think about the discussion about how we increase revenue, reduce expenses, and then the reserve, really thinking of the reserve from the standpoint of if there are spaces where we can leverage that on a short-term basis for a longer-term gain, where by spending some dollars early, we actually are able to be proactive so we can spend less later. I think being able to look at that. I love the discussion about innovation, leveraging technology. I wonder in our smart city initiative and plans, what else is in there that we haven't already implemented, from maybe doing more with data and data analytics so that we can hopefully deploy our staff to be, so that their work can be informed by the data and a little less, you know, manual type of work that we might have to do because the data systems are in place. I'm also wondering whether there's more we could be doing with grants or low cost loans like the TIFIAs. What other P3 public-private partnerships may still be out there, whether it's partnering at the local, state, national level, with our business partners locally. It sure seems as though we're all in this together, and to the degree we can look at where are those targeted spaces where we can put some of our money in, but we can amplify and grow the impact of those dollars because we're able to find partners that are interested in the same outcomes we're trying to do. And where are those things? So I think we've identified a lot of the threats, and I'd like us to talk to really look at, well, where are those opportunities, maybe in those surveys and the feedback and the outreach. There's some other opportunities we can find for using our money to amplify it to do more. So I think we will want to make sure that we have more meetings and not less, so that we really understand as a council what are all those options. At the end of the day, I think that the tough choices are, we clearly heard the needs outpace the resources and the revenue. So how much more money do we need by when? And then how it's going to be funded, who pays for it, will be those tough conversations. And we just finished talking about the equity lens. So how do we make sure that when we're making those decisions, we're really mindful of where those revenues are coming from? So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Robertson.
Thank you. Good conversation. So I really appreciate Deputy Mayor's request for asking for that benchmark information from Seattle, who went through the growth that we are just starting to be at the start of the bubble, if you will, and to see what happened, because we know that when you're adding a lot of jobs, I mean, we have the growth in the terms of construction, which is one-time money, construction of projects. But when you're adding a lot of jobs, the spin-off businesses that come from that and the economic development that comes from that, it does two things. It increases revenue into the city, the county, the state, but it also increases the need for services as we have more people downtown and Bellevue and elsewhere wanting to make sure that people stay safe, that our roads stay in good shape, that our that we can make sure that there's space for people. So having some really specific historic data on that point, I think will help. Tony, you're always so good at forecasting, but I think that we need maybe a more targeted forecast basis this time, because although I've been on the council when we've had down budgets, we're having this budget gap while we're in the midst of a substantial growth. And I don't think we've been in that exact position, at least recently. So I think getting those forecasts would be really, really good. I do agree with the comment that we should never use one-time money for ongoing programs. I think that that's really wise. We've talked about that before. You don't ever use one-time money, for example, to fund FTEs. So I agree with that. But the one-time money, whether it's an extraordinary REIT year, extraordinary sales tax year, or ARPA funds, the ARPA funds, of course, we want to take care of the people, but to the extent that we have one-time money, I'd like to leverage it in a way that creates more economic activity that will help fund future services for the city. So for example, my favorite project, the swimming pool project, the aquatic center would, and I'm not saying we're going to fund that with one-time money today, but just as an example, because I have that data off the top of my head. So that would create all these hotel rooms. I think it was 10,000 hotel room nights a year. It would create $25 or $30 million in economic activity. All of that is part of all that economic activity comes into the city's coffers. So comparing the spinoff of all these jobs, the spinoff of any investments we make in capital projects, the economic activity and the revenue, as well as the cost, I think is going to be really, really important. And I think Councilmember Zahn talked about that, is how do we leverage the money? How do we do public-private partnerships? In the last down turn is when we took out some bonding and we did some projects, because at that time, unlike right now, they were cheaper to do, and we could leverage that money. The interest rates were so low, the projects were really low, and we could get a lot of that stuff done. And that actually helped pave the way, literally and figuratively, for the growth that we're seeing today. So how to best use the money for capital. But of course, general fund is what we're talking about here. I believe the answer is yes, but one question is, does the blue line assume all of the new employees that we're going to need to staff Fire Station 10? And I think the answer is yes.
Yes, the answer is yes. The answer is yes, it does.
Great. And then the revenue assumptions we're going to have to look at. But in addition to the ones you listed, we've talked as a council about potentially doing an O&M levy for parks. That would be one that would be general fund. So there's different types of revenue sources that are capital. There's some that are general fund, but we want to make sure that we're looking at all of them. But my first choice is to figure out how we can leverage the growth and use that to fund our services rather than just going first to new revenue. But we're going to need to have everything on the table, as well as some really, really good data and forecasting that's much more specific moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, I'm going to make my comment and then we'll take a 10-minute break. You know, as inflation increases, it probably will, and as our housing needs increase, I really think we should be looking at bonding our House Bill 1590 money to help us pay for those emerging needs as they come along, because that will provide us with quite a bit of funding to address that and hopefully save us money in the long term. I really do. I was very proud of the fact that we didn't touch our reserves until we really had to, and they were there for us because of that reason. So I'm in support of reserving our reserves, but taking opportunities when we can. And I think House Bill $1590 is a great opportunity for us. So those are my comments, and I think it is 7:27. We will meet back here at 7:37.
Thank you.
We have a quorum. Would you like to continue, Tony, with your presentation?
So a quick check in our agenda. So here's where we are on our evening. We have a short capital investment update for you. This will be a fairly short item. It's basically talking about the criteria that we'll be using to make some decisions and how much money we're currently seeing available for the two new years in the CIP, years 28 and 29. And then we'll be turning the presentation over to Michael Shiosaki to talk about Parks long range capital planning. So with that, Evan, I will turn the next piece back over to you.
All right, so as Tony said, this next section, we are going to be going through the anticipated CIP process and criteria for 2023 and 2024. As has been the case in previous sections of tonight's presentation, we are seeking feedback on the criteria specifically. As a reminder, the general CIP includes major capital investments for neighborhood parks, new facilities like Fire Station 10, major planning processes like the comprehensive plan update, and infrastructure projects like transportation's overlay program, as well as Vision Zero. The current 2021-2027 CIP totals approximately $662 million in expenditures over the life of the 7-year period. So just some context there in terms of what we're talking about and the magnitude of what we're talking about. So much like general fund operations, the city's general CIP is facing similar economic pressures. As a refresher, the CIP is a 7-year capital investment plan that is updated every 2 years during the city's budget development process. Within that process, assumptions for project costs, debt obligations, tax revenues, and potential new projects are refreshed, and then 2 additional years are then added onto the end of the plan. In this case, we will be adding years 2028 and 2029. What's on your screen is what we call our waterfall process for identifying the amount of available revenues in those 2 new years to allocate to new CIP projects. When the city takes in revenues for capital projects, the first obligation that we have to that money is to pay our debt obligations. This is a city policy and assures owners of city debt that they will be paid on time and as expected. The second call on this revenue is for ongoing maintenance for city infrastructure and assets. And again, this is city policy that states that we will commit to maintain the existing infrastructure that we have before we decide to build anything new. So that is city policy as well. And finally, the last call on revenues is for the continuation of any existing council approved projects. So without specific guidance from council, we don't remove a project, as has been past practice, to include these existing projects in the 2 new years that we add in the capital investment plan. So after being filtered through these 3 steps of our waterfall process, the remainder of the tax dollars anticipated can be allocated to new projects. So what does this look like in practice, really? So walking through those same waterfall steps, you could look at the pie chart on the right side of your screen going clockwise. So taking that first 28% of revenues for debt service, followed by ongoing maintenance before our levy and discrete projects, and before arriving at our unallocated resource portion. Based on our best estimates today, and as I was saying from the inflation conversation earlier, today is a relative term. This is the best estimate that we have on this given night. We are anticipating that approximately $45 million will be available to allocate to new or existing projects for 2028 and 2029. Obviously, the economic uncertainty that we talked through earlier applies to this available resource amount, and with all the uncertainty that comes with our conversations earlier. However, this amount does not anticipate any new grant or stimulus funding that may be awarded to the city during this time period. So the city will work to make itself competitive for these dollars that might offset existing revenue streams, but this plan does not assume an outcome for what are often very competitive grant processes. So you will also notice that our real estate excise tax, also known as REIT, is coming in strong at about $20 million above budget for 2021. So as a result, the total amount of unallocated money that we have during this process is really closer to $65 million. So while this will bolster parks and transportation projects in the near term, this revenue source is very volatile and it limits the city's ability to accurately project REIT revenues over the life of the 7-year CIP. So staff will continue to bring back updates on CIP revenues throughout the budget planning process, as well as executing the CIP from 2023 through 2029. So this unallocated $65 million for 28 and 29 is really set against a whole host of priorities that are varied across the entire city. These capital priorities include on the slide are, the ones included on the slide are just a representative sample of a much larger inventory of needs that include critical infrastructure like Bellevue Way HOV, future phases of West Lake Sammamish, quality of life project improvements like neighborhood parks, the aquatic center, and additional phases of Maidenbauer Bay Park, as well as less visible but still really vital projects like city technology and facilities that underlie a lot of our city services that we have. Shortly, Director Shiosaki will be walking us through some of those quality of life projects that are identified as part of the Parks and Open Space System Plan update and the associated funding gap for those projects. So long story short, the resource constrained CIP will take careful prioritization and balancing. And that's where we're hoping to get some feedback tonight, is really the criteria for that balancing. So for that balancing to take place, staff has previously worked with the following criteria, and our ask tonight is that, is this list still accurate? Is this still the priorities and the criteria that we should have? Is there anything missing? Is there anything that we would like to tweak? We're looking for feedback in this area specifically. So first, staff looks at whether new or existing projects are effective at achieving the goals within the city's mission, strategic target areas, and council priorities. In short, do these projects achieve the results that are desired? We also look at whether projects have mandates for new requirements set by regulation or law at the state or federal level. We also look at financial factors to determine whether a project is able to leverage other funds or avoid potential costs. And we look at the cost benefit scenarios and whether or not a project is set up for financial success in the long term. Is it sustainable in short? There are also questions about timing and urgency. Is a project ripened enough to be included in the CIP plan? And is it the best use of funding compared to other projects that are currently in the queue? And finally, the last piece of our criteria is we look at the level of service provided and is this the right project at the right time? So cadence is an important factor that we have as well. So these are the criteria. Again, tonight we are just looking for some feedback about whether this is the correct list, if there's anything missing for our 23-24 CIP process going forward that we can take away from this conversation. So Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to do our list in reverse order, starting with me. And I actually don't have a comment on this right now. I'll have to think more about it. So I'll go to Councilmember Robertson.
Thanks. So no, I don't really have any questions or comments. I think that what you have set up looks pretty good. I definitely would like to, we are going to need to make sure that we know as we move along, because not all colors of money are the same. So REIT can only be used for certain things. We want to know what it can be used for as we are appropriating that. I do think REIT should be used for things that are more of the quality of life, because that money comes in from big real estate sales, which then bring in new people and employees into the city. So those quality of life things probably should be what's funded by that to make the lives of the people that are living and working here a little bit better. So thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Zahn, followed by Deputy Mayor Neuenhuis.
Yeah, thank you. So when I think about our CIP, I really want to stress the comment you made already about the fact that we want to position ourselves well to be competitive, because the bipartisan infrastructure law has a lot of money from the standpoint of potential grant opportunities. And this one in particular, there are more dollars that go potentially to cities of our size. So to the degree that we can really look at, I think we're well positioned with Vision Zero, for example, and our safe systems approach, our mobility implementation plan. So as we look at other potential sources of grant funding, where are the other places where we can, again, best position our CIP dollars to be able to get matching funds? And again, whether we can find partners that are also interested in those same kinds of infrastructure projects. When I think about the aging infrastructure and making sure that, because I hear when I'm out in the community about the fact that, sidewalks that are not contiguous, or sidewalks that really need to be replaced because there's tripping hazards and whatnot, the ADA aspect of our community and how that works. When I think about balancing the priorities and the criteria, I agree with the scaling and the timing, and how do we actually build to scale to support the kind of growth that we're seeing in our community and that continual growth. I'd like to make sure that in addition to sustainability as a holistic viewpoint, to the mayor's point earlier of making sure that we're also looking at the climate change and sustainability related to that. And then I didn't see in the criteria the equity lens of as we look at where we deploy CIP in our community. I mean, I believe it's there, but it would be good to make sure that the criteria specifically stated in there. And, to me, I think we do a really good job with our GIS and our mapping to be able to holistically show in our CIP where we're spending our money. I do have to say that as we have more people driving, that we're seeing more accidents and challenges associated with bicyclists and pedestrians. So I'd like to see how we can find partners or grants to be able to accelerate our Vision Zero even more to work on those improvements. And I recognize that that may not always be the easiest thing to do. And yet I believe it's an important aspect of what we need to do moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, followed by Councilmember Stokes.
Thank you, Mayor Robinson. Yeah, I don't think I have any real questions or additional comments right now. I mean, I just really appreciate you set this up, the criteria, and especially on slide, I think it was 34 there on the starting place for balancing the CIP. I think that's a really important lens to look at this through the effectiveness, through the mandates, the financial factors that my colleagues have mentioned numerous times, and the timing and the urgency, and then also the scaling. I think that's a very appropriate thing for us to be thinking about. Is it the right project at the right time? I think through that lens, we should be thinking about all these projects. But I like the way you set this up. I think this will lead to some very good conversations, some difficult decisions, but good conversations about where we need to go as it relates to the CIP. So good job, and look forward to more of this later. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Stokes, followed by Councilmember Lee, and then Barksdale.
Yeah, just a couple of comments on good comments so far, and I think the way you've laid that out is very, very good. I liked what Councilmember Robertson said at the beginning. But, you know, I think that what we're looking at is keeping in mind what is the project effectiveness? What are the projects that will have the best impact on the city and on the services that we need? I know we take that into account, but sometimes things just pop up, and I'm hoping we'll focus on that and include, and this is what I was referring to, is the addition. How does it add to the quality of life in the city? Because that's the thing that keeps us going. And I think that's very, very important to do. And the other is, you know, how does it impact economic development? How is it something that multiplies the income, the development of the community, all these things that make this community going forward. As I said earlier, I think we're in a period where we have great opportunity to move forward, and we need to focus on those things that keep us going forward, because we could, go off track, and this could change a lot. So I'm hoping the whole focus on this. How can we move this forward, do the things that we need to do to increase income and actually make this continue to be a great city? And I think you're on a good path on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My point of view is I like leveraging. When I talk about innovation earlier, it's working with other folks, partnership. So I think that's where we get the biggest bang for our buck. To do that, it's a matter of timing and opportunity. We talked about that before. And the timing, opportunity, points at practical sense is federal infrastructure funding. We have lots of money, over $1.5 trillion ready to be handed out. And, so we have lots of people we can partner with, particularly in transportation. In our city alone, we have multimodal system. And together with the regional transportation partners, Metro, Sound Transit, these all benefit from technology. When we talk about technology, we talk about AI, we talk about 5G, we talk about autonomous technology, and these things, bring us all together because we have very much the common goal and vision, and the technology itself also, cuts across all sectors. Extends to not just in transportation, but again, it's a opportunity and timing, but in other things. And we talk about Vision Zero, just somehow it has caught on. And we're talking about, ultimately it could extend to incorporating other partners, which is talking about environment, climate change. All these are examples where we can get bang for the buck. And so I believe in working together, and ultimately it all ties to economic development. Because when we have all these things that we can make happen to make people's life easier, more cost effective, more efficient, business will come here. Quality of life is going to be improved. So I think that this is where I want to emphasize is leveraging. And the timing is there, opportunities there, and use technology to cut across all these ways and places that we can form partnership, regional partnership, and work together. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee. Councilmember Barksdale.
Thank you. I appreciate all the discussion and points that have been raised already. I guess I was curious, looking at it holistically, how does evaluation happen? I guess I'm interested in if there's sort of an opportunity not to remove the human aspect from it, but more so to bring some clarity of how these align with each other. If there's a way for us to think about scoring these, not so much for action, but for discussion to help us talk through the priorities.
Sure. Evan, could you go back one slide for me so I can look at the criteria? Thank you very much. we don't traditionally score them per se. We kind of think of them as different types of factors as you look at the collection of projects. Because as with most things, as Councilmember Robertson mentioned early on, is we do have some color of money issues. So a project, we might have a source of money that needs to be used for a very specific source or a very specific size of project. So we kind of, it's more like a three-sided Rubik's Cube, if you could go with that, you know, it's son of all these pieces that you're putting together in order to kind of put up the package that makes the most sense with the revenues you have coming in the door. That's really how it works. We certainly do hear which projects are more important than other projects, though we certainly do see that coming through from the council on a very regular basis. So we do see that as well. Does that make sense? We don't. It's more challenging to score numerically, just because of the color of money and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I guess, and that makes sense. I'm not going to harp on it. I guess I was just thinking we could add that as part of the criteria
Sure.
To inform scoring and ranking.
I think
So
that's helpful. Thank you, Councilmember Roxton. I missed that point earlier. I apologize. Thank you.
And I think our feedback from the retreat's going to weigh in on this as well. It'll be very helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So go ahead, Tony. I think this is the last part of it.
This is the last thing. We'll now turn it over to Michael Shiosaki, and Evan will bring up his PowerPoint here in just a minute, and we'll turn it over to Michael to take us through the parks capital funding item. Thank you so much for your time this evening, Council. I have appreciated your feedback that you've given us.
Thank you, Tony and Evan, and good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and members of the City Council. I'm Michael Shiosaki, and thank you for having me this evening. So tonight's presentation on a parks funding strategy responds to the Council's adopted 2021 to 2023 priority to advance a parks funding strategy, including consideration of new funding sources for operations, maintenance, and construction. So tonight we seek council feedback on whether staff should explore some specific parks funding options and return to council with additional information. Next slide, please. But before we move into that presentation, I first just want to take a moment and reset, help us think a little bit about our incredible city in a park, and think about the forests and the trees and the beaches and sports fields and sports courts and other recreation facilities. Over these past 2 years, our park system has again demonstrated its incredible value to the community, as we've seen parks use increase dramatically as the park system provided the places we could safely gather for respite, recreation, and well-being. So tonight I will provide a quick overview on the background and history and how the park system came to be, touch on the 2022 Parks and Open Space System Plan update, and that update process is nearing completion. Discuss the key capital project needs identified in the plan update, talk about park needs versus revenues and potential future funding sources, and then next steps. Next slide, please. So as we know, Bellevue's highly regarded park system has not been built in a day. It's taken years of strong leadership, compelling vision, developing big plans, and ongoing incremental financial investment. Whether it's been the downtown park or the botanical garden, or gradually acquiring land for a significant public waterfront park on Lake Washington, Bellevue has continued to demonstrate one of its hallmarks, and that is setting the long-term vision, developing big plans, and successfully implementing those plans over many years. And over the last decade, the city has just seen unprecedented growth in residents and workers, and we need to continue that investment as there is much more to do. So starting in the 1950s through 2008, the city has approved 10 ballot measures for parks, and this has been a mixture of bonds and levies. Next slide, please. The most recent ballot initiative for parks in Bellevue is the Parks and Natural Areas Levy that passed in 2008 and expires in 2028. There have been many notable projects that were funded in part from this levy and are now complete, including completing the Circle and the Northeast Corner Gateway projects at the downtown park, Surrey Downs Neighborhood Park, the Bellevue Botanical Garden Visitor Center, the Bellevue Youth Theater, and acquisitions for the future Lake Sammamish Neighborhood Park. Leveraging of the levy dollars with private funds and other public grants has been a big part of the levy's success. And only 2 projects remain to be completed as we near the end of the levy. Next slide, please. So as we complete the current levy, it has aligned well with the timing of the update of the Parks and Open Space System Plan. So this is a 20-year plan that's updated every 6 years. And in addition to planning for the future, the plan update allows us to be eligible for state and federal grants, and it's required as a part of our Parks Agency reaccreditation. The park plan update process is nearly complete. The Park Board has reviewed the plan and made its recommendation, and the Council's review of the plan is set to happen in the coming weeks. So tonight is really a bit of a preview of a future Council agenda item. The update in the our Parks and Open Space System Plan includes a review of our community profile and future demographic trends, and a review of level of service provided by our network of neighborhood parks and trails. It looks at the progress we've made completing capital projects since the last update, and it reviews adopted citywide long-range plans and policy documents to make sure the park plan is in alignment. But a key part of the update is seeking public input and feedback on the current use of the park system and future priorities. And that public outreach has just been completed. Next slide, please. So public outreach has been done with a many-faceted approach, a strong social media campaign through a variety of outlets like WeChat and the engaging Bellevue Hub. We've met with boards and commissions and about 20 neighborhood organizations, and targeted outreach to some of the organizations and agencies we work with who serve historically marginalized communities and people of color, and whom we are aware of through the work of our Human Services Division. But I will add that this outreach work has been impacted by COVID, as in-person workshops and focus groups just haven't been possible. Next slide, please. So 2 surveys were conducted as key components of the outreach for the plan update. One, a statistically valid survey, and the other, an open online survey. And the chart on the right shows the distribution across the city of those who we reached out to or those who responded to the open survey. And as you can see, there's been pretty good distribution across the city of respondents. And from the demographic data we've collected in the statistically valid survey, it shows that we continue to get better in developing a survey sample that is reflective of the community profile. Next slide, please. So some data points from the survey. So when folks have been asked, in the past 12 months, have you or someone in your household visited any of the following types of public or private parks or recreation facilities in Bellevue? And I would say these statistics have stayed the same over, I would say, decades of my work in parks and recreation, and that trails and natural areas are consistently some of the best used elements in any park system, including Bellevue. So those trails and natural areas, followed by, I think in Bellevue, waterfront parks are very important. We are a city surrounded by water. And I think because the Bellevue Botanical Garden is so great, partly parks with display gardens, then moving on to just open areas, and then other kinds of more structured recreation facilities. Next slide, please. So this information is about reasons for visiting parks, and it's pretty much in alignment with the previous status. So people are going out there to enjoy nature and to relax, spend time with family and friends and exercise, and then also participate in a variety of sports. Next slide, please. So, so this slide, when asked what we in Parks and Community Services should focus on over the next 10 years, responses have been pretty evenly split. Half of the folks are saying we should focus on developing and improving our currently owned parks, and about half are saying we should be acquiring new parkland and natural areas. So a bit of a split there. Next slide, please. So in looking at park development priorities, and this is consistent with both the youth use data and the reasons for using facilities, once again, trails and natural areas are kind of on the top of the heap, followed by waterfront parks, and then unstructured play, and then more structured recreation. Next slide, please. So in terms of common themes, and of course, some of this obviously makes us smile. What we heard back is that, the parks in Bellevue are well maintained and really important to the quality of life in our city. We need to continue to protect natural resources and to continue to purchase more open space as it is available. Look at expanding trail connections and wayfinding. And then there are certain neighborhoods in the city that don't have the same access to parks as some others, and I'll touch on that more in a minute. And we need to continue to address those cities that are growing the most and are most in need of additional open space. Park designs also need to, to work for people to interact and to gather. And when we look at a variety of facilities in our parks, we need to include emerging sports like cricket, like pickleball, and off-leash areas, and additional skating facilities, be it skateboard parks or for online skating, and dispersed facilities and courts across the city. And then when we provide relevant facilities for diverse populations, people are really talking about including facilities for people with disabilities, the active aging community, youth, and people of different ethnicities. And then last but not least, as we look at preserving Bellevue's history and its cultural resources, we need to consider additional interpretation. Next slide, please. So the Parks and Open Space System Plan, and if we can go back to the previous slide, that'd be great, thank you. It identifies really a menu of desired capital project needs over the next 20 years. The system plan isn't constrained by a budget amount, and the projects included far exceed currently budgeted funds. The funding strategy in the plan is general and assumes that the CIP funding is the foundation for all the capital needs of parks and recreation. The capital project needs are grouped into 7 focus areas or capital project areas. And I'm about to go through each one of those. And we've listed several examples of kinds of projects in those focus areas. And the list shown are not all inclusive. So next slide, please. So here's a few of the first buckets of potential need. And that is kind of the big bucket of open space, greenways, wildlife corridors, and trails. People want to make sure that we're continuing to purchase open space. And I think we've heard a lot about additional acquisitions along Coal Creek. We need to continue to grow the trail system and connections to that trail system, whether it's the Mountains to Sound Greenway or the Lake to Lake Greenway, and connections and park amenities along the new East Rail alignment. So in terms of parks facilities, there are areas of the city that don't have adequate neighborhood parks. And I think we've heard about that in Eastgate and in Factoria and in the Bell Red neighborhood. So acquiring neighborhood parks a priority under parks facilities, along with developing existing sites we have in Bell Red and downtown. We also need to continue phased development of the Botanical Garden and at Crossroads and Wilburton Hill Park. In terms of active recreation facilities, on that list is certainly a new aquatics facility, sports courts and sport field improvements, and add off-leash areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of urban park systems, those are the fastest growing areas of our city. So we need to be looking at park acquisition and development downtown in Bell Red, Eastgate, and Wilburton. Waterfront access continues to be a priority, both in completing the vision of the Lake to Lake Greenway, and that is building that park on Lake Sammamish. In addition, future phases of Maidenbower Bay Park and overall waterfront park renovations, such as at Chisholm or Clyde Beach or at Newcastle Beach Park. And we need to stay focused on partnership opportunities. whether it's working with the Bellevue Botanical Garden Society or the Bellevue Boys and Girls Club. They're all keys to us delivering on future capital priorities, along with attention as we renovate historic structures and there are many in the Bellevue Park system, along with inclusion of public art in parks. Next slide, please. So let's see here. So you've seen some of the needs identified in the Parks and Open Space System Plan over the next 20 years, but I also want to place those needs in the context of current capital revenue for parks. So next slide, please. So this slide shows, and I want to really emphasize this, rough order of magnitude costs for project needs identified in the Parks and Open Space System Plan. So these are capital project needs that total somewhere between $500 million and about $1 billion. So somewhere in that range. And that would then be offset primarily by funding out of REIT. And that would be about $300 million, which, I guess I'd like to emphasize the funding gap. But then I'll, on the next slide, please, talk a little bit about some of the funding options we currently have. So I talked a bit about the current Parks Levy, and we also get funds from the current King County Parks Levy. But we also have been relying on grants, partnerships, rent, and donations. And some of these are very opportunistic. That means the funding is linked to a specific acquisition or development grant or a partnership on a specific site or project. So next slide, please. So as we look to the future, here are some of the potential funding options. And this list really hasn't changed much over the years. The options we're most familiar with are the voter-approved funding sources, either bonds or levies. And I will state that one of the distinct options, although with my Parks Director hat on, I probably can't recommend, is to not seek any additional funding from new voter-approved or council-approved funding sources. This would really slow the pace of land acquisition and future park development, especially at a time when the city is growing so rapidly. So lastly, in terms of timing, for this year, time is short and there are some hard and fast deadlines. Should there be interest by the council in moving ahead with a ballot initiative of some kind? One key date is that to get something on the ballot for the November general election, that ballot language would need to be submitted no later than the close of business on August 2nd. So with that, I will thank you for your time this evening, and I seek your feedback and hopefully can respond to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll do that same order again. I'll start us off. I have a few questions. First of all, I realize we're talking about capital funding here, but I do have a concern. I understand that some of the public sports programs for kids that are not in select are really going away, and there's a whole lot more public funding going toward select programs and kind of making it hard for kids who are not able to afford the high fees to participate in programs like that. So I wonder what the city can do in creating these capital projects that provide opportunity for sports field use, how we make sure that we're providing opportunities for all the kids and not just the ones who can pay the high fees. That's my first one. Do you want to answer that and then I'll go on?
Well, that's certainly in terms of programming. I mean, we can certainly look at that distribution and how those fields are being used. I think, we're typically not necessarily looking at the select leagues as much. I think we're trying to provide kind of that broad range of access in sports. But, we can certainly look into that more in detail.
Okay, I appreciate that. Maybe there's some lower rate if you're not select so that those teams can more easily use the fields. All right, so do we have any, are you going to come out even on the current parks levy? And I know that that one expires in, is that 2028?
It's 2028, yes. Correct.
Okay, and so you say you have 2 more projects. Is that going to use all the money? And can you make a case for doing some sort of another different kind of parks levy sooner than waiting until that one expires and this renewing it for different projects?
You know, I'd say that would be certainly, I'll answer the second question first. That would certainly be something I think we would like to look into and bring back more information on that. Certainly, there are many projects to move forward on, and they only get more expensive over time. I think in terms of your question about the 2 remaining projects in the current levy, they are moving forward with development of the park at Lake Sammamish. And I think in part that's on hold as we try to finish out the acquisitions on the lake. So, you know, we would hope to accomplish as big a phase 1 as is possible. And then the final project is development at Bellevue Airfield Park. And that project obviously is a little bit on hold as we look at a remaster plan related to the aquatic center.
Okay, so a new levy that paid for an aquatic center, if we decided to do that, would complement the existing parks levy.
It could certainly do that, yes.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Robertson, followed by Councilmember Zahn.
Thanks, Michael. The parks levy that we passed in 2008, as all property taxes do go down over time as far as their purchasing power. That is the case with that one as well, isn't it? The millage rate has just gone down, down, down. So, and that's why a lot of people are now shying away from doing 20-year levies. They're doing ones that are no more than 10 because they really need to be renewed sooner because the purchasing power falls off so much. So isn't it true that if we wanted to pass a new parks levy, we could do that and supplant, AKA retire early, the existing one?
Well, you know, I will almost look to Tony to answer that more specifically. Sorry to lob this one to you, Tony.
The answer is yes, but yeah, Tony.
Happy to say the answer is yes, though I would tell you that we would need to do some legal work with the city attorney's office to validate that, just in true honesty. But I believe from my past practice, yes, you can retire an existing levy.
So we could do, if we do put a park levy on the ballot, I would want to put in the projects that were in the 2008 levy that are still to be done, move those forward, retire the old levy, and this would be a replacement levy. So because, and like I said, and I think that if we do that, it should be a shorter duration because the purchasing power just goes down, down, down. So I would be interested in, I think there's several reasons to do it now. And the mayor alluded to some of this. We're growing like crazy. Land is getting scarcer. Projects are getting more expensive. So if we increased our purchasing power of the levy by doing a new capital levy, we could do a lot more with it, including, it wouldn't pay for all of, but including paying for part of the capital stack needed for the aquatic center, having more open space because that open space is disappearing as we're growing, et cetera. And, you know, getting the waterfront park moving on Lake Sammamish. I think that we should also consider an operations and maintenance levy as going hand in hand with that. With that O&M levy, we could fund programs like the mayor mentioned, sports programs for youth. I think we need more and more programs for our youth right now, particularly because so many youth are struggling and we need to really amp up the programs. I know there's grant money from AWC for programs that help youth, that's through AWC and the OSPI, the Superintendent of Public Construction, so that are trying to make sure that they increase youth programs. I'd love Bellevue to be part of that. I think that we should definitely look at that for this year. Even numbered years are better years to run levies. You get more voters and more people have a say. Waiting until 2024 just would seem too long because we are, you know, except we're growing so quickly. So that would be my preference, is to get moving on it. I also do think it's fair for And I definitely want to see some more off-leash dog areas. I would almost put those in, not into active, but into just open space and passive recreation. But we need one near downtown for sure, and elsewhere. Finally, I know that it was on the list in the agenda memo to look at park impact fees. Those are typically only paid by residential development. There's a couple cities that do them for commercial, but pretty much across the board, it's just residential development because those are the folks that use the parks. And as we're getting more and more and more dense, we need more and better parks and recs facilities. So I'm not saying I'm going to be yes on it, but I do think it's fair to continue to move that idea forward, so that growth pays for growth. We've talked about that at length. I think it's fair for our residents, and I think it's fair for the new residents to help buy into our beautiful award-winning park system. So thanks.
Okay, I was just so mesmerized there. Council members on.
Yes, thank you, Michael, for the presentation. Having been the liaison for the Parks Board the last 2 years, I know how hard the staff and the board has been working on the parks and open space and really understanding what the needs are. So I appreciate that. Definitely agree that parks south of I-90, it is a bit of a park desert. So looking at that, tree canopy, and then land acquisition for park development, because as my colleagues have said, land is only getting more expensive. So I agree with, being positioned well so we can make those kind of strategic investments, and then thoughtful use of the land that we have that is quite limited. Now, with that said, a couple things on the 300 million revenue. I'd like to understand a bit more about the sources of those funds and contribution. I heard you say something about REIT. So were there other sources that's within the 300? So I'd like to get a copy of that to better understand the actual revenue associated with that part. And then the other one I'm wondering about is, as I look at the whole list, I see the aquatic center there. I see, the need for dog parks, off leash, cricket and pickleball. I don't see the cross-cultural center on there, and it seems like that should be part of the parks and community services. And then the Grand Connection lidded park, would that be part of this? Because if we're looking at a broader levy that pays for aquatic center and other things, I want to make sure that we are inclusive of the type of things that we want to be, that's part of our vision for the future. And with that said, then I also want to make sure if we are looking at a replacement levy that retires the one in 2028, that we are holistically looking at all the needs for revenue in the city, which is what we've been talking about with our budget. So, on our mobility implementation plan and the transportation part, Vision Zero, affordable housing, whether we have enough funding within the 1590. And then on the climate and the environmental side of how are we paying for our municipal greenhouse gas reductions and fleet that we have that support our parks and open space in that department. So I really appreciate having this discussion early so that we can better understand what we're trying to do. I just want to make sure that when we have that conversation, there's a holistic discussion about the needs for that vision of the future. So we are careful that we don't end up in a space where we put out a levy that is only a more limited view, which then when we finish those other conversations, the community says, oh, I didn't realize that we were asked to pay for this as well. I thought that this other one was it. And there's a bit of, I think so there's a timing and making sure that we are taking a comprehensive, holistic view of revenues and where it might need to come from. Thank you.
Okay, Deputy Mayor Noonhouse.
Thank you, Mayor. Great presentation, Michael. Thank you so much. I think we can all agree, open spaces, parks. We are that city and park. This is a core value. So I'm so glad that we're looking at this in such a holistic and organic way now. I am absolutely for moving this forward in terms of looking at, and necessarily a levy, but it could be a bond or what have you. This needs to happen for all the reasons, as Councilmember Robertson so eloquently noted. Land is getting more expensive, the amount of growth, and for me personally, I think we have to get a park in Eastgate, Factoria area. That should be job number one for us. It is, if we truly want to be that 15-minute city, if we truly care about an equitable distribution of parks throughout this city, we've done a disservice to those two areas, and we really need to get them a park that they can get to easily with their kids or with their family, and enjoy it as so many other parts of the city do. I also think that the operations and maintenance levy also makes sense. I'd love to see you come back with some additional thoughts on that. I do like the idea, although we'd like to see some more data on retiring the existing levy that's supposed to retire in 2028. That's also a very interesting thought to look at that, and might give us some additional revenue to look at some other additional projects. But we need to keep this conversation going, and I look forward to doing it, and having that conversation of all these different, but which are all very much worthwhile. But I think we need to take a hard look at those outstanding park deficiencies that should be first and foremost on, I think, everybody's mind. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Stokes.
Yeah, this is very exciting, and I got involved in city government and politics and things back in 2008 in putting together, getting schools and athletic groups together to get that levy passed after having a failure of a bond levy earlier. And it's just gone great. I mean, it's just been fantastic. And then on the Parks Board, and Len was there at the same time, the mayor. And this is, it goes by fast. We've gotten so much done with what we've had here, but what is exciting about this is that we have these great opportunities moving in front of us. I mean, we have a fantastic system, but we have the opportunity now to make this even better. And as a number of council members have mentioned over and over, we need to make sure this is spread throughout the city. So I think that's the suggestions, and I'm glad to hear all the enthusiasm for moving this forward. Putting together a levy to to pay for more parks and also on maintenance is kind of consistent with what the school district does, and they do that very successfully. And I think that's and taking it shorter time period. But I agree with Councilmember Robertson that I think we really need to move on actual projects going forward, as well as, of course, finishing up what we're doing now. And we could put that together and get something going on this. I think it's feasible, and I think the city is in a position right now in a mood to do this. We keep getting talked from people for all kinds of things around. We have a really comprehensive program here. So I'm enthused about it, and I'm really excited about working with the Parks Board and the community to make this thing happen. So appreciate the presentations and the very thoroughness on this. And this is going to be a very significant addition to this city, and we're going to grow in numbers. I mean, the more people are coming here and having parks and the trails and all these things, and Baden-Bar Bay, I want to get that finished. And I'm glad the comments made about including, things such as the Grand Connection and other pieces along the way that are all part of this that will make this system, I think, greatly contribute to the economic development and to the healthy development of this city. So this is a great time to be involved in this, and I'm excited about it. and appreciate the way you've laid this whole thing out. But I do think we need to move on this now and get it together. And I think we're in a good position to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is obviously very relevant, pertinent to the city. The city is called, Bellevue, a city in the park. And so we have done a lot of good stuff. We have a wonderful plan, and many of the projects, that have been done previously. And now we're looking at new projects. And, there's never enough money to meet all the needs that we want to really continue to fulfill, the city in the park. It's a plan that's been laid out for so many years, and it's been carried on, or still it's work in progress. The challenge I have here is, I always mention the devil is the detail. When we do surveys, we have data, and I appreciate doing all that stuff. But, the data shows all the things that we are doing, the things that we are that's made available for people. People have been, taking advantage of it, using it, enjoying it, appreciating it. And they want to do more of it, obviously, because that's on their mind. And this is what the city provides, city in the park. However, we are entering into a situation that we have more things, more facilities we haven't really thought about before. It's not really just in the park anymore. We talk about where people can go to trail, go to board and beach and so on. Now I think we are talking about one major piece of the park's responsibility is the piece that bring people together, the human service piece. I think that's a piece we can either develop it by the people supporting it. But as we know, most of the things that we're talking about, whether it be downtown park or whether it be just recently the Maidenbower Bay Park, it takes years and years. When I first came to council, I was on the City in the Park committee. And people have been advocating, building support. And even though they know it's part of the City in the Park project, but it takes a lot of support, a lot of awareness, a lot of people coming, to talk about it. And so what I'm specifically going to is, I appreciate all the projects being discussed. I think they're all very good, very important. We need to continue to carry them forward. But I just want to be sure the new new ideas, new facilities do not get left behind, or doesn't have to take another 10, 20, 30 years to become reality, which is what I appreciate Councilmember Zhang was talking about, raise the question. How about cross-culture center? People don't relate to that with a park facility. We're going to do a parks levy. Nobody's going to talk about, well, let's have money to put in the cross-culture facility, because but in a way, it's built in the survey. If you read through it, people want to be together. People want to be with their families, with friends. People want to have a place where they can, be together. And I think this is something that and also I hope it's a council agenda, because it is a project the council has supported and in process of, looking into it. And I think that we need to keep going, doing whatever that we are trying to do more, improve on. But I just want to be sure we do not leave out and neglect, forget about the things that we want to do, especially if it's a council priority. I would want to make sure, not just looking at the surveys, or nobody even talk about a community space for multicultural purposes. I want to be sure we do not forget it, leave it alone, and it never happen again, because people are not talking about it, because people don't realize it. So we need to be sure we just provide some leadership, some impetus, some initiative. And again, devil is in the detail. So I hope that we will be not forgetting it. We're going to keep it and not keep it, but put some reality on it and help to move it forward and further along. And so it's a big thing. It's a good thing. We have to live to our reputation, but it's not just park. It's the whole realm, the whole purpose, the whole reason, for bringing people together and doing things together. So that's, so I want to be sure, the staff and the city council and everybody is, conscientious of that fact so that we don't, ignore it, lose it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Councilmember Barksdale.
Right, thank you. So I don't have any points related to what's been said. I think it's all been important points. I guess I would say, while we talk about individual projects, I guess it builds on Councilmember Lee's point. At the end of the day, at least in my mind, these spaces, these public spaces, are about people connecting, whatever the entity is, right? In the product world, we talk about features versus experiences. A lot of times people will talk about particular features. In this case, you could think about each one of these projects as a feature of the city. But at the end of the day, I think it's about what people's experience is in our community. And I think a big part of that is what enables people to connect. So wherever we land on any of these projects, I think it's important to keep that top of mind. So I don't have any points about anything else that's come up, but just wanted to put that there.
Thank you. Very good input. So I know you're looking for feedback from the council for preparation on this budget. And does the staff feel like you've gotten everything?
Thank you, Mayor and council members. I believe we've gotten very good feedback from the council, both on the operating and the capital, as well as the parks. There are some items that have been great ideas and questions that have been asked that we'll need to get back to you on, and some other topics that we'll need to revisit with the council on. So thank you very much for the feedback and the time.
So I know you had this set out for us, but I can't remember what it said. When will you be back in front of us again to discuss this more about the budget?
We'll need to let us get the feedback, go back and look at the feedback you've given us to put something together to bring back. I don't have an exact time period yet, Mayor.
Okay, so Tony, if you can, just show that slide again of the timeline so we all have an idea of what's coming up next.
Certainly. Evan, are you still out there?
I am. I just will have to switch presentations. It'll just take me a moment.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. It'll just be a minute, Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Apologize. Slide.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate that. Mayor, is this what you're looking for?
There you go. Okay, so we got through the first dot.
First dot, check mark.
2, 3, 4, 6 more. So the next time the council will be discussing these ideas is at the retreat. So I'll look forward to doing that and getting input from the community multiple times, and we're on our way. So thank you very much. Is there anything else on the agenda that we need to discuss tonight that I might be missing? I don't have anything on my end.
Nothing from our end.
Okay, good. All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.